I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because I finally understood where I stood in my own family. Ethan Miller would later say, as the moment that changed everything began quietly inside his sister Emily Carter's wedding. Though the truth of it stretched back several hours earlier when he first arrived at a polished suburban event hall just outside Chicago, Illinois, where white floral arrangements lined the entrance. Soft music drifted through open doors, and guests in formal attire exchanged polite smiles that carried just enough distance to feel intentional. Ethan had flown in from Denver, Colorado, 2 days earlier, carrying a carefully wrapped wedding gift and a cautious hope that today might finally smooth over years of emotional distance between him and Emily. But almost immediately upon stepping inside, he noticed something subtle yet unsettling in the way people responded to him. As greetings were shorter than expected, conversations shifted slightly when he entered a circle, and eye contact lingered just long enough to acknowledge him without truly welcoming him. Though he told himself it was just wedding stress, nothing more. Still, the atmosphere carried a quiet weight that grew heavier when seating arrangements began, and while other family members were guided effortlessly toward prime front row tables adorned with elegant name cards, Ethan was initially directed toward a side section near the back, only to be redirected again by a coordinator, who led him toward a smaller table positioned uncomfortably close to the exit doors, where guests constantly passed through and conversations rarely stayed long enough to feel meaningful. And it was there that he noticed Emily glance in his direction for the first time since his arrival, her expression unreadable, neither warm nor cold, simply absent of recognition. Before she turned back to the ongoing preparations as if nothing had changed, Ethan sat down anyway, choosing patience over confrontation, telling himself that today was about her happiness, not old tensions. Yet every passing minute added another layer to an unspoken message he was beginning to understand, especially as he observed how family members naturally clustered into groups that seemed to exclude him without effort or discussion. And as the ceremony approached, Ethan found himself reflecting on moments he had never brought up, like quietly covering Emily's rent during a difficult semester in college, stepping in to pay unexpected medical bills when she couldn't, and contributing to early wedding expenses without ever attaching conditions or expectations, believing that family support was something given freely rather than measured. But belief alone began to feel fragile as the room filled with guests and anticipation rose. And when Emily passed near his table once again without acknowledging him, something inside Ethan shifted into a calm clarity that surprised even himself. Not anger, not frustration, but a simple recognition that he had already seen enough. And so he slowly stood, adjusted his jacket, and looked across the room one final time, not searching for attention or validation, but observing a space that suddenly felt distant, before taking measured steps toward the exit where his seat had been placed from the beginning. And as he walked, the noise of the celebration continued unchanged behind him, unaware that the quiet absence forming in that moment would soon become the turning point that no one in that room would be able to ignore, because sometimes the most significant rupture in a story does not come from what is said, but from the decision not to stay long enough to be treated as invisible any longer. As Ethan Miller continued walking toward the exit doors of the wedding hall, the sound of laughter and soft music behind him felt strangely distant, as if the space he had just left no longer belonged to the same world he was standing in. And with each step he took past the polished marble floor and neatly arranged floral decorations, the quiet certainty inside him grew stronger rather than weaker, because what had begun as confusion earlier in the day had now settled into a clear understanding that required no further explanation. Outside the main hall, the late afternoon air in suburban Illinois felt cooler than expected, and he paused for a brief moment near the entrance, not out of hesitation but out of instinctive reflection, as guests continued arriving and passing by him without noticing anything unusual. While inside, the ceremony was still preparing to move forward on schedule. Back inside the venue, Emily Carter was adjusting her veil with the help of a bridesmaid when she finally noticed a small disruption near the seating area, a subtle shift in attention among a few guests who had turned their heads toward the back of the room, though at first she dismissed it as nothing significant, assuming it was just part of the natural movement of people during a large wedding gathering. However, within minutes, a coordinator approached her with a slightly concerned expression and quietly mentioned that Ethan had left his assigned seat, which caused Emily to pause for the first time that day, though her reaction was restrained, almost controlled, as she simply asked when he had left, and upon hearing that it had been only moments earlier, she turned her gaze briefly toward the exit doors without moving toward them, as if weighing the importance of the situation against the tightly scheduled ceremony unfolding around her. Meanwhile, Ethan stood outside near the edge of the venue property, looking out at the parking area where rows of cars were aligned under soft sunlight, and for the first time since arriving, he felt the absence of noise around him as something almost grounding rather than isolating, because it allowed him to think clearly about what had just occurred without interruption or emotional pressure from the surrounding environment. Inside the hall, small conversations began to form among guests who had noticed the empty seat near the exit, with some assuming he had stepped out temporarily, while others quietly speculated without certainty. But the event continued moving forward as planned, with no formal pause or announcement made, maintaining the appearance of normalcy even as subtle curiosity began to spread. Emily, now more aware of Ethan's absence, found herself distracted during brief moments between preparations, though she did not yet take action to follow up directly, instead relying on others to confirm details. And it was during this period that a series of logistical issues began to surface, starting with a delayed confirmation from a vendor responsible for final arrangements, followed by uncertainty regarding certain scheduled payments that were expected earlier in the day, creating a quiet but noticeable tension among the wedding planners who were working behind the scenes to maintain control of the situation. Ethan, unaware of these developing complications, slowly walked along the edge of the venue grounds, his thoughts returning briefly to earlier moments in his life when he had chosen consistency over recognition, times when he had supported family obligations without expecting acknowledgement, and as he reached his car, he placed his hand on the door handle but did not immediately open it, instead taking a final look back at the building where the celebration continued without him, unaware that his absence had already begun to shift the balance of events inside in ways that would soon become impossible to ignore, because sometimes the impact of leaving is not measured in the moment of departure itself, but in the quiet unraveling that follows when someone who has always remained steady decides, without noise or confrontation, that they will no longer stay in a place where their presence is treated as optional. Inside the wedding hall, the ceremony continued forward in its carefully planned sequence, but beneath the surface of music and polite conversation, a growing sense of disorder began to form in quiet layers that most guests did not immediately understand. As Emily Carter stood near a mirror with her bridesmaids adjusting final details of her appearance while trying to remain focused on the schedule ahead, yet her attention kept drifting back to the earlier report that Ethan Miller had left his seat near the exit and had not returned. At first it seemed like a minor interruption, something that could be addressed later after the ceremony concluded, but that assumption began to weaken when a second coordinator approached her with a more urgent tone, explaining that there were unresolved confirmations tied to several vendors who were expecting final payment approvals that had not been completed as planned, creating immediate uncertainty in the coordination flow of the event. Emily frowned slightly, not fully understanding the connection, and asked for clarification, only to learn that certain arrangements, including the floral delivery adjustments, the extended venue rental coverage, and the last-minute audio and lighting updates, had all been processed through accounts that required verification from someone who had been assisting informally behind the scenes. And when the name associated with that support was mentioned in passing conversation among staff, Emily felt a subtle shift in her expression as she began to recognize patterns she had previously ignored. Meanwhile, in the main hall, guests continued to take their seats as the ceremony neared its next stage, but small disruptions became more noticeable as staff members moved slightly faster than before, checking phones, speaking in lowered voices, and occasionally stepping aside to confirm details, while some guests who had earlier noticed Ethan's empty seat began to quietly speculate that his departure might not have been casual after all. Emily, now visibly more distracted, asked one of her family members if anyone had spoken to Ethan before he left, and in response she received hesitant answers that did not provide clarity but instead added more uncertainty. especially when it was mentioned that Ethan had been involved in several logistical conversations in the weeks leading up to the wedding, including payments that had allowed certain upgrades and adjustments that made the ceremony look more polished than originally planned. This realization did not immediately register as emotional shock, but rather as a slow unfolding awareness that something foundational might have been overlooked. And as Emily turned away from the mirror and looked toward the entrance of the hall, she briefly considered stepping out to call him, but hesitated as she was reminded that the ceremony timeline was already in motion and guests were beginning to settle into expectation. Outside, Ethan remained near his vehicle, standing still for a moment with his hand resting on the door frame while watching the building from a distance, unaware of the internal discussions now taking place inside. And as he finally opened the car door, his phone vibrated with a notification, followed shortly by a second and third message that he did not immediately read, each one increasing in urgency from different members of the wedding coordination team attempting to confirm missing approvals and verify payment trails. Back inside, the situation reached a clearer point when a senior coordinator confirmed privately to Emily that several key expenses had been temporarily covered through a single account that had not been formally assigned to the wedding budget. And upon reviewing the transaction records quickly on a tablet, Emily saw Ethan Miller's name attached to multiple entries that extended over weeks of planning, including deposits that had secured essential services that would have otherwise been delayed or unavailable. And for a moment she stood completely still as the realization settled in that the structure of the entire event she was standing in had been partially supported by the same person who had quietly left earlier without confrontation. The music in the hall continued to play, but it felt slightly distant to her now, as conversations around her softened into background noise while she processed the fact that the absence of one person had already begun to affect the stability of the event in ways that were no longer theoretical but actively unfolding. And as she looked once again toward the exit where Ethan had been seated earlier, the understanding grew that his departure was not a reaction of anger, but a final step in a long pattern of being present without being truly acknowledged. And that realization would soon reshape not only how the rest of the ceremony proceeded, but how every person in that room would later remember what it seemed, at first, like a simple moment of someone quietly walking away. As the wedding ceremony inside the hall continued to move forward under carefully arranged lighting and soft instrumental music, the atmosphere that once felt smooth and controlled had begun to carry a subtle instability that most guests could not immediately identify. Yet Emily Carter could feel it building in real time as she stood near the side of the preparation area, holding her breath slightly longer than usual between instructions from coordinators who were now moving with a quiet urgency that contrasted sharply with the earlier calm of the event. The discovery of Ethan Miller's financial and logistical involvement had not fully settled into emotional understanding yet, but it had already begun to influence decisions in small but important ways. As Emily reviewed additional details on a tablet provided by the wedding coordinator and saw line after line of contributions that extended beyond what she had previously assumed, including deposits for venue extensions, adjustments for seating arrangements, and additional service upgrades that had elevated the entire ceremony without her realizing the full scope of who had enabled them. Meanwhile, in another part of the venue, family members and close guests began noticing slight changes in staff behavior as conversations grew more focused and less celebratory, with several coordinators stepping into hallways to make urgent phone calls and returning with expressions that suggested unresolved complications were spreading across multiple areas of the event planning structure. Emily attempted to maintain composure as she prepared for the next stage of the ceremony, but her attention repeatedly returned to Ethan's absence, which now felt less like a simple departure and more like a structural gap that was beginning to reveal itself in practical consequences. And when one of her relatives quietly asked whether Ethan had been contacted, the question was met with a pause that carried more meaning than any immediate answer could provide. Outside the venue, Ethan remained near his vehicle for several moments after receiving multiple notifications on his phone, each message increasingly urgent in tone as different. Members of the coordination team attempted to confirm payment authorizations and clarify missing approvals, yet he did not respond immediately, instead standing still with a calm expression that reflected neither anger nor regret, but rather a sense of final separation from the environment he had just left behind. Inside the hall, Emily eventually stepped away from the main preparation area and moved toward a quieter corner where she could speak privately with a senior coordinator. And it was there that she received a more complete explanation of how several essential services had been secured through contributions linked directly to Ethan, including arrangements that had prevented delays in vendor scheduling and ensured that critical elements of the ceremony would proceed without interruption. And as she listened, the reality of the situation began to take shape, not as a single moment of realization, but as a layered understanding of dependency that had been invisible until now. The coordinator explained that without those contributions, certain elements of the wedding would have required last-minute cancellations or visible reductions in quality, and although the tone remained professional, the implications were impossible to ignore, especially as Emily began to mentally reconstruct the timeline of planning and recognize how often Ethan had been present in supporting roles without seeking acknowledgement. Across the hall, guests continued to settle into their seats as the ceremony reached its next scheduled phase. But subtle inconsistencies in timing became noticeable as announcements were slightly delayed and staff coordination required additional adjustments, creating a sense of quiet uncertainty that contrasted with the expectation of a perfectly seamless event. Emily, now visibly affected but still composed, asked again for confirmation of Ethan's current location, but no one had a clear answer beyond the fact that he had left the venue earlier and had not returned. And as she processed this, she began to understand that his departure had already triggered effects that were not emotional in isolation but operational in nature, influencing both the flow of the ceremony and the confidence of the staff managing it. Outside, Ethan finally opened his car door and placed one hand on the steering wheel, pausing before entering as if acknowledging the weight of what he was leaving behind without needing to revisit it. And as he sat inside the vehicle, the wedding hall remained visible in the distance through the windshield, still active, still moving forward, yet now fundamentally changed in a way that no longer depended on his presence, because what had once been an invisible form of support had quietly stepped away, leaving behind a space that others were only beginning to recognize as essential after it was already gone. Inside the wedding hall, the ceremony continued to advance according to schedule, yet the emotional atmosphere had shifted into something more fragile and uncertain, as if the structure of celebration was still intact on the surface, but quietly reorganizing itself underneath. While Emily Carter remained in a state of controlled focus that required constant effort to maintain, as she moved between brief conversations with coordinators and moments of silent reflection where she replayed every detail she had just learned about Ethan Miller's involvement. What had begun as fragmented information was now forming into a coherent picture that revealed a level of support she had never fully acknowledged, including financial contributions that had directly influenced nearly every major aspect of the event, from venue enhancements to vendor coordination. And as she stood near the edge of the preparation corridor, she realized that the wedding she was about to complete had been shaped in part by a presence she had recently treated as secondary. Meanwhile, staff members continued to adjust behind the scenes, responding to small but accumulating irregularities in timing and confirmation processes, with one coordinator quietly explaining to another that certain approvals were missing from expected channels, creating delays that required immediate restructuring of task assignments in order to keep the ceremony on track. And although these issues were handled discreetly, their frequency made it increasingly difficult to maintain the illusion of effortless execution. Emily attempted to proceed with the next phase of the event, but her attention was repeatedly drawn back to Ethan's absence, which now carried a different weight than before, no longer simply a personal decision to leave, but a factor actively influencing the stability of ongoing arrangements. And when she briefly asked whether anyone had managed to re-establish contact with him, the answer remained unchanged, as no response had been received despite multiple attempts. Outside the venue, Ethan sat in his vehicle with both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, the engine still off as he observed the wedding hall from a distance through the windshield, his expression steady and reflective rather than emotional, while his phone continued to display new messages that he had not opened. each one representing a growing urgency from within the event that he had already stepped away from. After several moments of stillness, he finally turned the ignition but did not immediately drive, instead taking a final look at the building where the celebration continued, aware that what was unfolding inside no longer depended on his presence in any visible way, even though the effects of his earlier involvement were still actively shaping outcomes. Back inside, Emily was approached again by a senior coordinator who requested a brief private discussion, and during this exchange she was informed that several remaining logistical elements depended on prior arrangements that had been informally supported through Ethan's contributions, including final confirmations that ensured vendor synchronization and last-stage execution of scheduled services. And as she listened, her understanding shifted from abstract awareness to concrete realization, because the absence of those contributions was already beginning to create measurable strain in the coordination process. The coordinator spoke carefully, avoiding emotional framing, but the implications were clear enough that Emily found herself pausing longer between responses, processing not only the information itself, but the broader implication that much of what she had taken for granted in the planning process had relied on support that was now no longer available. Across the hall, guests remained largely unaware of the internal adjustments taking place, though a few began to notice slight delays between scheduled segments and subtle inconsistencies in announcements, creating a sense of mild confusion that contrasted with the expectation of seamless celebration. And these small disruptions accumulated quietly, reinforcing the sense that something essential had shifted behind the scenes. Emily eventually stepped away from the conversation and returned to a quieter area, where she attempted to steady herself while reviewing the remaining timeline of the ceremony. But each item she examined now carried a different meaning, as she began to recognize how many elements were indirectly connected to Ethan's earlier involvement. Outside, Ethan finally shifted the gear into drive, but before moving forward, he allowed himself one last moment of still observation, during which he no longer saw the event as something he was part of or responsible for, but rather as something continuing independently of him. And as he slowly drove away from the venue, the separation between presence and absence became fully defined, leaving behind a space inside the wedding hall that would continue functioning on the surface while quietly adjusting to the absence of the person who had unknowingly held more of it together than anyone had realized until it was already gone. As the ceremony inside the wedding hall moved into its next stage, the atmosphere that once felt carefully controlled had now become noticeably more tense beneath the surface, even if most guests could not immediately identify the reason. While Emily Carter remained positioned near the side of the venue with a composed expression that required continuous effort to maintain, as she absorbed the growing list of complications that were now emerging from the absence of Ethan Miller. What had started as a quiet departure had evolved into a structural shift in how the entire event was functioning. And Emily was beginning to understand that Ethan's role had extended far beyond what she had previously acknowledged, as additional confirmations from coordinators revealed that certain vendor schedules, service adjustments, and final payment authorizations were still indirectly tied to arrangements he had helped establish earlier in the planning process. Meanwhile, staff members moved with increasing urgency behind the scenes, attempting to stabilize timing inconsistencies that were now affecting multiple parts of the ceremony flow, including delayed transitions between scheduled segments and last-minute adjustments in seating coordination, all of which required immediate attention to prevent visible disruption in front of guests. Emily attempted to remain focused on her upcoming responsibilities within the ceremony, but her attention repeatedly drifted toward the realization that Ethan's absence was no longer a symbolic gesture, but a practical variable influencing the event's stability. And this understanding created a level of internal conflict that she struggled to express outwardly, as she continued interacting with family members and coordinators in brief, controlled exchanges outside the venue. Ethan was now driving slowly along a quiet suburban road, maintaining steady focus on the path ahead while his phone continued to receive messages that he chose not to open, each notification representing an increasing sense of urgency from within the event he had left behind. Yet his expression remained unchanged, reflecting not emotional reaction, but a settled decision that no longer required further justification. Inside the hall, Emily was once again approached by a senior coordinator who requested a private moment, and during this conversation, she was informed that several final execution steps for the ceremony depended on previously arranged support systems that had been informally facilitated through Ethan's involvement, including logistical confirmations that ensured vendors were synchronized and essential services remained aligned with the event timeline. And as she listened, the implications became increasingly difficult to dismiss as abstract information, because the effects were already visible in the form of delayed responses and coordination strain across multiple departments. The coordinator explained calmly that while the ceremony could still proceed, it would require constant adjustments to maintain flow, and this statement caused Emily to pause longer than usual as she processed not only the operational impact, but also the realization that much of the stability she had assumed was independent had in fact been partially supported by someone who was no longer present. Across the hall, guests continued to participate in the ceremony, with limited awareness of the underlying adjustments. Those subtle signs of disruption became more noticeable, such as brief pauses between announcements and minor shifts in timing that suggested increased coordination effort. Behind the scenes, creating a quiet sense of inconsistency that contrasted with the expected seamless progression of a wedding event. Emily eventually stepped away from the conversation and stood near a quiet corner of the venue, where she briefly closed her eyes and attempted to organize her thoughts. But each reflection now returned to the same realization that Ethan's role had been both more extensive and more invisible than she had ever fully recognized. And as she opened her eyes again, she looked toward the main hall where the ceremony continued without interruption on the surface. Yet she could no longer ignore the fact that the foundation supporting it had begun to shift in ways that were only now becoming fully visible after the person who had maintained it chose not to remain. As the wedding ceremony continued inside the hall, the progression of events began to feel increasingly fragile, not because of any single visible failure, but because of a series of small adjustments that staff members were now forced to make in real time in order to maintain the appearance of smooth execution. While Emily Carter stood closer to the center of the venue than before, her presence more involved yet her expression more controlled, as she processed the growing understanding that Ethan Miller's absence was no longer a passive detail, but an active factor shaping every remaining moment of the event. Earlier assumptions that the ceremony would proceed unaffected had now been replaced by a quieter reality in which timing delays, coordination gaps, and missing confirmations required constant attention from multiple staff members, and Emily could see this reflected in their movements. As they communicated in brief exchanges, checked schedules repeatedly, and adjusted sequences that had previously been considered finalized. At the same time, Emily was beginning to recognize the broader pattern of Ethan's involvement, not as isolated acts of assistance, but as a continuous structure of support that had quietly sustained much of the planning process. And this realization carried an emotional weight that did not express itself through outward reaction, but instead through prolonged moments of silence between conversations, where she would pause and look toward areas of the hall where Ethan had once been seated. Meanwhile, outside the venue, Ethan continued driving along a stretch of road bordered by residential neighborhoods and open green spaces, maintaining a steady pace as his phone remained active with notifications that he did not engage with, each message representing a growing effort from inside the wedding to re-establish contact or confirm missing information. Yet his decision remained unchanged, as he focused instead on the physical act of leaving behind a space that no longer required his participation. Back inside, a senior coordinator informed Emily that additional adjustments would be required for the next phase of the ceremony due to unresolved logistical dependencies. And although the explanation was delivered in a calm and professional tone, the implications were clear, as it confirmed that certain elements of the event were still indirectly connected to arrangements that Ethan had previously supported, and without those connections actively in place, the coordination team would need to compensate in real time to avoid noticeable disruption. Emily listened carefully, asking specific questions about which parts of the ceremony would be affected, and as she received detailed responses, she began to mentally map out the remaining timeline of the event with a different perspective, recognizing that what had once appeared to be a fully self-contained structure was in fact reliant on contributions she had not fully acknowledged or understood. Across the hall, guests continued to participate in the ceremony with only partial awareness of the internal adjustments, though a few began to notice slightly longer pauses between segments and subtle changes in pacing that suggested increased behind-the-scenes effort, creating a quiet sense of inconsistency that contrasted with the expectation of uninterrupted celebration. Emily eventually moved toward a quieter area near the side of the hall, where she briefly observed the ongoing ceremony while remaining partially separated from it. And during this moment, she reflected on how Ethan had consistently operated in ways that did not draw attention to himself, yet had influenced outcomes that were now becoming more visible in his absence. And this realization did not arrive as a sudden emotional shift, but rather as a gradual consolidation of details that had previously seemed unrelated. Meanwhile, Ethan slowed his vehicle slightly as he passed a series of intersections, glancing briefly at the rearview mirror before continuing forward. And in that reflection, there was no sign of urgency or regret, only a quiet acknowledgement that the separation between him and the event had become complete in a way that required no further explanation. While inside the wedding hall, the ceremony continued to move forward under increasing coordination effort, maintaining its outward appearance of stability even as its internal structure adjusted continuously to the absence of someone who had once been quietly essential without ever asking to be seen. As the wedding ceremony moved deeper into its final scheduled stages inside the hall, the atmosphere that had once been carefully maintained as seamless and celebratory now carried an unmistakable sense of strain beneath its surface. As Emily Carter stood closer to the central area of the venue, where she was expected to remain for upcoming formal moments, yet her attention was divided between the ongoing proceedings and the growing realization that the absence of Ethan Miller was no longer an isolated fact, but a continuing influence shaping the stability of everything around her. Staff members moved with increasing precision and urgency, adjusting timing between segments, quietly communicating updates, and compensating for gaps that had become more apparent as the ceremony progressed. While Emily observed these changes with a level of awareness that made it impossible to return to her earlier assumptions about how independently the event was functioning. At the same time, she was now fully aware that Ethan's involvement had extended across multiple layers of preparation, not as a visible organizer or formal coordinator, but as a quiet contributor whose actions had supported essential elements of the wedding without drawing attention. And this understanding created a growing internal conflict as she processed how little recognition had been given to that role. Meanwhile, outside the venue, Ethan continued driving along a longer stretch of road that led away from the suburban area, maintaining steady speed, while the wedding remained active only through the constant stream of notifications appearing on his phone, each message reflecting increasing urgency from inside the hall, yet he remained disengaged from responding, choosing instead to focus on the continuity of movement away from a situation that had already reached its conclusion in his mind. Back inside, Emily was approached again by a senior coordinator who informed her that a final sequence of the ceremony required immediate confirmation adjustments due to unresolved dependencies that had been previously managed through informal arrangements. And although the explanation was delivered carefully, the meaning was clear enough that Emily did not need further clarification to understand that Ethan's absence was still directly influencing operational flow. She asked for specific details, and as the coordinator outlined the remaining adjustments required to keep the ceremony on schedule, Emily mentally tracked each dependency and began to recognize a pattern that extended beyond logistics into a broader realization about how much of the event's stability had relied on contributions she had not fully acknowledged. Across the hall, guests continued to engage in the ceremony with limited awareness of the internal coordination challenges, though subtle changes in pacing and timing had become more noticeable, including brief pauses between announcements and slightly delayed transitions that suggested additional effort behind the scenes, creating a quiet tension that contrasted with the expectation of uninterrupted celebration. Emily eventually stepped away from the central area and moved toward a quieter section of the hall where she could observe the ongoing ceremony without immediate engagement. And in this moment of distance, she reflected on how Ethan had consistently functioned in roles that remained largely invisible, yet had produced tangible effects that were now becoming more apparent only after his departure. And this realization settled into her understanding not as a sudden emotional shift, but as a layered recognition of patterns that had been present for a long time, but never fully acknowledged. Outside, Ethan continued forward on the road, passing intersections and gradually increasing the distance between himself and the venue. While inside the hall, the ceremony pressed on under continuous adjustment, maintaining its outward structure even as its internal coordination adapted in real time to compensate for the absence of someone who had once supported it quietly. And as Emily looked across the hall at the remaining flow of the event, she could no longer ignore the fact that what she was witnessing was no longer just a wedding proceeding as planned, but a system actively recalibrating itself in response to the space left behind by a person who had finally chosen not to remain where his presence had never been fully seen. As the final moments of the wedding ceremony unfolded inside the hall, the atmosphere that had once been carefully maintained as polished and uninterrupted had now settled into a quieter, more reflective state, as if everyone present had gradually become aware that something essential had shifted throughout the course of the event. While Emily Carter stood near the central aisle preparing for the concluding formalities with an expression that remained composed outwardly but carried a depth of internal understanding that had developed over the previous hours, the ceremony continued according to its remaining schedule, yet every transition now required subtle coordination adjustments from staff members who had been working continuously to maintain flow. And although most guests remained unaware of the complexity behind these corrections, Emily could clearly see the effort involved in preserving the appearance of seamless celebration. At this stage, she no longer viewed Ethan Miller's absence as a simple departure or emotional reaction, but rather as a defining factor that had revealed how much of the event's stability had depended on contributions that were never formally acknowledged. And this realization gave the final moments of the ceremony a different emotional weight than what had been originally intended. Meanwhile, Ethan continued driving farther away from the venue along open suburban roads that gradually transitioned into less populated areas, maintaining steady control of the vehicle while the constant stream of messages on his phone gradually slowed in frequency, though he remained disengaged from responding, allowing the silence between notifications to reinforce the distance he had created. Back inside the hall, Emily participated in the concluding formal sequence of the ceremony, exchanging required acknowledgments and maintaining composure as cameras and guests focused on the expected final moments. Yet even during these traditional steps, her awareness remained divided as she observed how staff continued to adjust timing and coordination in subtle ways to ensure that nothing appeared disrupted. When the ceremony reached its formal completion and guests began to transition into reception activities, Emily briefly paused near the edge of the hall before moving forward. And in that moment, she reflected not only on the events of the day, but on the broader pattern that had become undeniable, recognizing that Ethan had consistently contributed support in ways that were essential yet unrecognized, and that his departure had not created instability so much as revealed the extent of what had already been quietly sustaining everything. Outside the venue, Ethan's vehicle continued along the road without interruption as he passed beyond the immediate surroundings of the wedding location, and as the distance increased, the connection between him and the event weakened into something purely historical rather than active. Inside, Emily eventually stepped away from the central area and joined a quieter space where she could observe the ongoing reception preparations. And as she did so, she became fully aware that the structure of the wedding she had just completed was no longer dependent on a single moment of celebration, but on a network of unseen contributions that had only become visible through absence. And this understanding settled into her perspective with a calm clarity that replaced earlier assumptions, leaving her with the recognition that some presences are only fully understood when they choose not to remain, while the world they helped hold together continues forward, adjusting quietly to the space they leave behind.